But I think one of the most important things, in my mind, that he's done is his work on the 1826 trial. I remember that I read this many years ago, almost 20 years ago, 18 or 20 years ago, I read the 1826 trial in Con Brody's book, and then I read Francis Kirkham's book, A New Witness for Christ in America. And in his book, I thought that Kirkham had some good evidence to show that the trial was a forgery, that it wasn't an authentic document. And Kirkham's work was quite convincing to me. But as I looked into it deeper, I saw problems with it, and by about 1970, I was convinced that there probably was something to the trial. But anyway, Wesley went back, made a number of trips back to by Bainbridge to search the Fortham documents on it, and then it was in 1971, in July of 1971, he found the papers which proved the trial, that it was authentic. And the question's often asked, well, what is the significance of the find? What does it mean now that the papers are discovered? And I have some quotations here by Francis Kirkham on the trial that was written before Wesley Walters made the discovery that proved that. But I think we listen to these. This will give us an idea of the real importance of it. Francis Kirkham said, "A careful study of all facts regarding this alleged confession of Joseph Smith in a court of law that he had used a seer stone to find hidden treasure for purposes of fraud must come to the conclusion that no such record was ever made, and therefore is not in existence. If any evidence had been in existence that Joseph Smith had used a seer stone for fraud and deception, and especially had he made this confession in a court of law as early as 1826, or 4 years before the Book of Mormon was printed, and this confession was in court record, it would have been impossible for him to have organized the restored church." And that's in the book, A New Witness for Christ in America, Volume 1, pages 385 to 387. Kirkham goes on, he says, if such a court record confession could be identified and proved, then it follows that his believers must deny his claimed divine guidance, which led them to follow him. He goes on, he says, how could he be a prophet of God, the leader of the restored church of these tens of thousands, if he had been the superstitious fraud which the pages from a book declare he confessed to be? And then there's the statement of Dr. Hugh Neely. In his book, The Mythmakers, page 142, the book says, if this court record is authentic, it is the most damning evidence in existence against Joseph Smith. Dr. Neely's book also states that if the authenticity of the court record could be established, it would be the most devastating blow to Smith ever delivered. And so we can see that the implications of this are plain, and the importance of this discovery. But I wanted to say one more thing about Wesley Walters, and that is that he believes that the sword of truth can cut both ways, and I believe that he will give the truth. If tonight he felt that the record were not authentic, he would tell us. And one thing that leads me to this belief is the work he did on the Oliver County defense, a document which I believe was genuine many years ago in the early 60s. And there turned out photographs at Yale University of what purported to be an original, which many people believe to be an original of this Oliver County's defense, which was an anti-Mormon publication. And but Wesley Walters looked into the matter, and he found that it was not an original at all, that it was a 1906 printing and had been cut up and pasted in a book, and the title page had been removed in such a way that you couldn't tell this. So from that, I was led to conclude that that was a forgery. This was an anti-Mormon work, so I think Wesley Walters could give us an unbiased, truthful opinion on these matters. And there's been the question tonight as to whether this can be taped, and of course you can see many people are, and there's no restrictions at all. You can tape it, and also make copies and give them to your friends, anything you want to do like this. So I'll turn the time over now to Wesley Walters.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've been here in Utah preaching a week of evangelistic meetings, and I was asked if I could stay over to give 2 talks in the areas that I have probably done more work in regards to the Mormon field than any other place. So I don't profess to be the final word on anything, because there's always material that still turns up, and you have to, as a scholar, take that into consideration. But I feel we're at the point now, in regard to the 1826 trial, that we can draw some conclusions that will stand up validly. And we recognize this was a far-out place to get to, and so I said that what I would do is state my conclusions first and then give a little background preparatory to the talking about the money digging and the trial itself, so that anyone that was late getting here would not miss the heart of the talk. And the conclusions that I've come to are not new or startling, but I'll give them to you. First of all, my conclusions, I think it's firm and without question now, that Smith did engage in money digging, accompanied by magic rituals and practices. And secondly, I think it's fairly firm now that the idea of discovering gold plates developed out of this money digging practice. And third, I think that the method for searching for treasures with a stone placed in a hat and then his face buried in the hat, that it's clear that this was put forth as the earliest method by which the plates were translated. That is, the same method he used to search for treasure was the same method he claimed to do his translating of the gold plates by. And finally, I think it's also clear by now, there's enough evidence to show this, that Joseph Smith never really lost his interest in treasure hunting, nor his interest in things magical and occult. Now, just a little preparatory background before we get into the matter of Joseph Smith's money digging. In this area, we are still largely in the field of having to depend upon sources that were written after the Book of Mormon had come out and people had heard about Mormonism. This doesn't mean these sources are unreliable, but Mormons usually tend to discredit them if they prove in any way embarrassing to their approach or to their position. And so as a scholar, you have to be very clear that you're not trying to build a case on late testimony, but this is at this point all we have. And that concerns the matter of the rodman in Pulteney and Wells, Vermont. This is sometimes known as the Wood Scrape Affair. It always reminds me of a title of an Old Man from Uncle series, the Wood Scrape Affair. But it got its name from Nathaniel Wood, who wanted to be pastor of the Congregational Church in Pulteney. We're not sure of his motives, but there seems to be an old state law that whenever a person became a pastor in Vermont, he was entitled to 100 acres of land. So there might have been a method in his madness of wanting to become the pastor. They didn't let him become the pastor, so he decided to start his own church. And he soon had a little following gathered that rivaled the Congregational Church in Pulteney. And not more than a couple of miles from Pulteney was the town of Wells. Wells was the home of William Cowdery, who was the father of Oliver Cowdery. And we're dependent upon an 1828 newspaper account from the Vermont American to give us some of the details about this Wood Scrape Affair. Unfortunately, that account mentions no names, but it is in agreement with what a man by the name of Joseph Frisbee wrote somewhere in the 1840s. Frisbee had joined with a couple of other local Pulteney residents to start a kind of a town historical society in which the members got together and read papers about the early days of Pulteney and Rutland County, where they were in Vermont. That's all right in the western edge of Vermont. You go west any further and you've gone over the state line into New York. So kind of down in the southwest corner of Vermont. And Frisbee, after Mormonism came on the scene, remembered this Wood Scrape Affair and remembered that as it developed, William Cowdery had a part in it, and also Joseph Smith Sr., Now, we can't verify either of those for certain, but we're in a lot better position for William Calvary than we are for Joseph Smith. However, wherever we are able to look at Frisbee's information, it does hold up. Frisbee tells us essentially this story, that after Nathaniel Woods got his church going, a gentleman from central Vermont by the name of Wingate, and he doesn't give us his first name, but he says he was from Orange County, and that in Orange County he was arrested for counterfeiting in about 1799. He made bail and then jumped bail and came to the town of Pulteney and moved into William Calvary's house in the town of Wells. And after he came on the scene, the use of the divining rod came into play, and the men connected with Woods Church all began to use water witching or dowsing rods, and they began to get revelations through the rods. This might have been a front, Frisbee doesn't say this, but this might have been a front for the counterfeiting operations, because one of the things they were doing through the rod was locating buried treasure. And Frisbee does tell us that Wingate had been a counterfeiter and was hiding out in the woods most of the time when he was not at William Calvary's, and that they were producing counterfeit money. And certainly the New England area was fruitful in that respect, in that counterfeiting was very, very prevalent up in the Vermont area. Well, when we checked into the matter, we found indeed that the Orange County records showed that in 1799, one Payne, P-A-I-N-E, Wingate, did stand trial, or was charged with counterfeiting Spanish milled dollars. The Spanish dollars had more silver in them than the American dollars, and the Americans liked to have the Spanish silver dollars instead of the American ones. And that's why they were always looking for Captain Kidd's treasure and Spanish hidden treasure and so on. But because of the popularity, why, some of them went into the business of manufacturing Spanish milled dollars. And they caught Wingate with a set of dies for casting them. His brother, apparently, at least the man was named Wingate, put up the bond, and the court record wanted to say that when the day of the trial came up, Wingate was not to be found. And so Frisbee was absolutely correct that Wingate had come in 1799, had jumped bond or bail in Orange County, and had been involved in counterfeiting. Now, after Wingate came to the area of Pulteney and Wells, we're told by Frisbee he changed his name to Winchell, and he remained there during the height of the rodmen's activities, which culminated somewhere after the turn of the century, between 1801 or 1804, somewhere in that period. There's a little discrepancy in the dates that haven't been cleared up yet. However, what they said was that the world was coming to an end, that they'd gotten this revelation through the rod, and they all gathered together in the building to wait for the end of the world. But the end of the world, of course, didn't come. And being very much discredited, Wingate, who had changed his name, as we said, to Winchell, left town and ultimately moved to Palmyra. And I had wondered, since he picked a name starting with W, when he wanted to take an alias, whether this might not be the elusive Walters the Magician of Palmyra that pops up in the Palmyra Reflector, whom nobody seems to be able to get a handle on or a line on. It could be our old friend, Mr. Wingate, alias Mr. Winchell, perhaps alias Walters the Magician. Be that as it may, the idea of the rod giving revelation seems to have stuck with Oliver Cowdery's family, and Oliver seems to have inherited it. For in the Book of Commandments, when Oliver wanted, at Palmyra now with Joseph, wanted to be able to try translating, his hand at translating the Book of Mormon plates, and nothing seemed to happen for him, Joseph got a revelation that, first of all, Oliver had done it all wrong, and he said you had to study it out in your mind and so on, and you had a burning in your bosom if it was right. But he said, don't worry, Oliver, in effect, he said, you've got another gift from God, the gift of the rod of nature working in your hand. Now, of course, that's a little too obvious a reference, so in the present, that's in the Book of Commandments 7, in the present corresponding revelation in Doctrines and Covenants, that's been changed to the gift of Aaron working for you. And it's not quite so obvious that Oliver had brought with him a residue of the old Rodman affair from Pulteney and Wells, Vermont. We're also told in one of the testimonies collected in 1833, shortly after Mormonism started, that are published in Eberhard's book, that Joseph Smith had a divining rod, Joseph Sr. And it could well be that Frisbee's right on the money. A part of this Rodman experience in Pulteney did indeed not only involve the father of Oliver Cowdery, but also the father of the budding young prophet Joseph Smith. Whether that was the beginning of their interest in some kind of supernaturalism or almost magic superstition is not entirely clear, as we said, and may never be cleared up. But once we get to Palmyra, it does become clear that not only Joseph Smith, Jr., but Joseph Smith's entire male members of his family, that is Joseph Smith Sr. and his brother Hiram and his brother Alvin, were all involved in the money-digging matter in the area around Palmyra. For example, Peter Ingersoll, in one of those 1833 testimonies, describes the general employment of the Smith family as being that of money-digging. And then he talks about how Joseph Sr. went through certain performances, and he watched him. And then he says Alvin went through the same performance, which was equally disgusting to Ingersoll. Furthermore, Martin Harris also spoke of other members of the Smith family being involved in money digging. He spoke of them in his interview in 1859, which appeared in Tiffany's Monthly, as though they had almost a money-digging corporation or company going, in which there was a Mr. Lawrence, as well as a Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph Smith Jr., and Hiram, and one or two others, and Joseph Smith himself. Now, of course, all of this material is in the testimonies that were indeed collected very early, but were collected by a hostile source, by Hurlbut, whose main object was to discredit the Mormons. And the Martin Harris interview was written up by a spiritualist, and therefore sometimes people have tended to cast doubts upon it. And so the question was, are all these testimonies to Smith's and the Smith family's money digging really reliable, or was this a fabrication, as Mormons have often claimed, a fabrication by non-Mormons or anti-Mormons designed either to smear Joseph Smith's name or to discredit him as a prophet or to outright persecute him? And that was a problem that I wrestled with, and there seemed to be one piece of evidence that could settle the matter once and for all if we could really establish that the trial that was spoken of in printed up in the back of Von Brody's book, taken from the Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia, if that trial really did take place, and Joseph Smith was tried 4 years before he published the Book of Mormon, and that trial did involve money digging as a key note or matter in it, then we should be able to take a new look at these testimonies and give them much more credibility than had been done heretofore. So with that in mind, I tried to find information on the 1826 trial. And in this I was greatly helped by the very fine research done by a Mormon scholar named Stanley Ivins, who died a few years ago, leaving a very fine collection to the Utah State Historical Society. Ivins had done most of the background work for me and had not only discovered that the trial record, or the alleged trial record, that had been printed in Schaff-Herzog's Encyclopedia, and from which Von Brody got it, that trial record had not only been printed there, but it had been printed a few years earlier in a British publication known as Fraser's Magazine. Now, in Fraser's Magazine, the journalist had been a gentleman from England who had been to Salt Lake City. And when he was there, he bumped into a young lady who, this account remains nameless, but it had to be Emily Pearsall, who had taken from her father's or uncle's docket book the trial record of Joseph Smith, for he had been the justice of the peace before whom Joseph Smith was tried. He made a copy of this. He happened to have omitted inadvertently one of the men, Howard Stowell, who was put on the witness stand in the trial. But he did copy the document fairly accurately, except for the omission of one entire testimony, and published it in 1873. So the Stanley Ivans had located this one account. Then, as we said, Bishop Tuttle came into possession of this article and published it in his article in 1883, 10 years later, in the religious encyclopedia known as the Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia, in the earlier edition, and not in the later editions. It was his entire article was deleted in later editions. And then, after this appeared, just 3 years after this appeared, Bishop Tuttle was called to be Bishop of Missouri, and he left Utah. And before he left, he turned over this trial record to the Methodists, who proceeded to print it in their magazine called the Utah Christian Advocate, which was printed here in Salt Lake City. And Mr. Ivans had dug up this material, and this gave me the first running start at trying to locate this document. Now, in this Utah Christian Advocate publication, there is a covering letter that the bishop wrote to the editor. The editor's name was not in this particular issue that I have in front of me here on this particular page, but the editor's name was Samuel Johnson Carroll, who was pastor of the Methodist Church in Salt Lake City and also editor here in Salt Lake of this Utah Christian Advocate Methodist magazine. And in the letter, he mentions that Emily Pearsall had turned the document over to him. Emily Pearsall had lived back in Bainbridge, where the trial had taken place, and her uncle had been Albert Neely. But he couldn't remember for certain, the bishop couldn't, whether it was her father or her uncle who had been justice of the peace. When you check the Pearsall genealogy, which Ivans had already done, you find that it was Albert Neely, her uncle, and that was the gentleman before whom the trial took place. Now, the trial record, I tried to trace. I attempted, first of all, to check the Episcopal Church. If it had been turned back to the Episcopal Church in Salt Lake City here, it's gone, because their archives, their church, with all their records burned subsequently. I tried tracking down Bishop Tuttle's relatives in the hopes that perhaps the Methodists had turned it back to him. I found out that all the extant material from Bishop Tuttle's personal family records was turned over to his oldest son, whose oldest son again received it, and he lived right in St. Louis, just 60 miles from me, and checking there was not any record there. Then I tried the Methodist archives. I wrote to all the Methodist repositories. I checked out personally a number of them. I wrote about unpublished Methodist material, made trips to the east to Drew where there were some to see if it might be there. I checked with all the conference historians to see if they had it, and nothing turned up. Then I tried tracking down the relatives of Samuel Johnson Carroll, and I was able to locate all 4 of his grandchildren. None of them have the record. One of them was able to tell me the house in which he died and in which his son had lived after him, and he had died, and it was occupied immediately by a lady who had been living there ever since, and I called her. And she carefully went through the entire place, but reminded me that when they had moved in, a lot of papers had been taken out and burned. One granddaughter who is living in Mexico does have some of Samuel Johnson Carroll's material, and it's in storage in Arizona. And she's not about to make a trip back to see whether it's among that material. So that's the one remaining place, as far as I could see, where it could be if the trial record is still in existence. But it was printed 3 times, And my good friend Michael Marquardt has very carefully gone through and made a comparison of the three printings. And there's a slight variation. Everybody has trouble reading certain words, and I think this is good evidence that there was a real document there from which all three men were making their transcripts into the newspaper and periodical publications. But that still didn't satisfy me. I thought, well, that's a dead end. So I tried coming at the problem from a different angle. I thought, well, if that can't be found, is there any other way of showing that the document was or was not authentic? Because I wouldn't want to accept it if it wasn't authentic. Interestingly enough, again, Stanley Ivan's work was immensely helpful because up until the time that I got Ivan's notes, why, I only knew of the Tuttle publication, and when Tuttle published his account, he left out what was the most valuable part of the document. Of course, for his purposes, it had no value whatsoever. At the end of the document was a list of the costs involved in the case. So, for example, we find the court costs listed as a warrant, 19 cents, complaint upon oath, 25 cents, 7 witnesses, 7.5 cents, recognizance, 25 cents, minimus, 19 cents, recognizance of witnesses, 75 cents, subpoenas, 18 cents, for a grand total of $2.68 to try the case. Now that was printed in the Fraser's magazine, and it was also printed in the Utah Christian Advocate. So I went to New York, to the county seat of Geneco County, where Bainbridge was, to Norwich, the county seat, with the hopes of perhaps finding one of several things. What were the costs charged in justice of the peace court trials then? How much did it cost to swear out a warrant? How much did a subpoena cost? And perhaps we could even find the arrest warrant of the sheriff. And with that in mind, I went to the county office building and was told they had nothing there. A lawyer friend of mine said, well, if he was arrested, maybe they'd have an in and out arrest record book. So with that in mind, I went to the sheriff's office. And the sheriff sent me downstairs and let me go in his big vault. But his arrest record, in and out record, only went back to about 1898. So that did me no good. I came upstairs and I said, well, I guess there's nothing earlier than that, is there? And the sheriff said, well, what about all that material that they took over to the Historical Society? I said, what material? He said, that old material they got from the courthouse. So then he directed me to Mrs. May Smith, who was the county historian, and I went over to their little old school building they had converted into a historical society, and I looked through the stuff up there. Well, they didn't have very much, and Mrs. Smith said, well, you sure that it's not over? Any of the stuff is not over with those old records in the basement? I said, I've been through the sheriff's records down there in the vault, and there's nothing there. She said, no, not in the vault, in the back room there. I said, what back room? She said, well, come on over and I'll show you. So back over I went to the county jail. And down the basement we went through a series of corridors to a back room, and my word, there were gobs of records back there. I didn't know where to start looking. There were old court books, and Mr. Kirkham had said that the county had no court records earlier than 1850. Well, here were court record books going back to the 1820s. But these were all appeal court records, and the justice docket would have been the initiating court, and that didn't do me any good. So we looked at some old sheriff's records on the top shelf that Miss Smith had gotten through already, and the rest of the material she hadn't gotten to. And there were just bundles of stuff all over the place, and another room behind with other bundles of stuff. And here it was Saturday, about noon or shortly after, and I had to drive to Baltimore and be there by the evening so I could preach in the morning. Well, that was the hardest decision in the world for me to make, to pull away from there and leave. Before I did, I got a little sampling of what was there. Just about waist level, there was a whole bunch of bundles, and Mrs. Smith said, what are these things? And I said, I don't know. And they had the names of the towns on the outside. They were bundled and tied in a little pink string. And the names of on the outside, like the town of Bainbridge or the town of Norwich, and then it had a date, 1822. Other bundle said 1821. So I opened one up, and I found out that they were the bills that had been handed in by each of the towns to the county by the officers of the towns, the townships, to get their money back for the services to the county. So when I opened them up and I saw the Justice of the Peace bills in there and the Sheriff's Constable's bills in there, I thought, oh, if I could find 1826 and 1830, the two times Joseph Smith was tried, if there was a trial, I'll bet it would be in there. Well, I looked desperately through every one of those, and you know, they had 1821 and 22 and 23 and 24 and 25 and 27 and 28 and 29 and 31. And the very ones I wanted weren't there. And I thought, oh my, I'll bet some Mormon's been through here and taken it off, because occasionally, you know, they've been known to do that. And so my heart sunk, but still there was all that stuff in the other room, and I had to leave. And I thought, maybe it's in with the other stuff. So by July, I got back there again, and I met one of my friends who was a former reorganized Mormon named Fred Pofoil, and we marched up together late in the day after stopping along the way to look at this and that and the other thing. And we got there sometime late in the afternoon, ate lunch. I remember I was starved to death practically, and grabbed a hamburger and then tooted on over to the courthouse. And we went down the basement again, and this time it had rained, cats and dogs, and the whole basement leaked, and we had to keep stepping over puddles, and everything in there had wilted. I had found Albert Neely's, in May, I had found Albert Neely's appointment as Justice of the Peace. Up until then, we couldn't even prove Albert Neely was a Justice of the Peace. We had this account about him being the Justice of the Peace who tried Smith, but we had no way of proving he was even a JP. And so having found that, I told Mrs. Smith before I left, I said, now get that document out of there, because it's the only evidence we got. When I came back, Mrs. Smith hadn't done a thing to get the document out of there, and I picked it up, and it literally just wilted over my hand. And I thought, oh, that's terrible, you know. Well, I started looking through the bundles again, and Fred wandered off into a dark corner. There's one little light bulb right about here, and you could see pretty well on the shelf, but over there it was just the blackness of darkness forever. And Fred wandered over there and found a cardboard box and said, hey, do you see these two cardboard boxes over there? I said, how can I see the cardboard boxes? I can hardly see you. So he said, well, come on over and help me look. So I'm looking in one box, and here were some more bills. But they'd been shoved up against the wall. The wall had leaked, and everything was damp and mildewy. And finally, I'm pulling out bills like this, and Fred pulls out a bill, and I'm kind of holding it up to the light, and Fred pulls out a bill and says, how does 1826 grab you? And I almost fell over. I grabbed the thing, and I ran over by the light, and I sat down on a little stool, and I took the thing off, and the first thing, one or two that I opened up, the thing I had to brush the white mildew off of everything first, and they were water soaked, and when I opened the first one up, it was completely wiped out, and I thought, oh, not that. You have that close, and you missed it, you know. So I went through, and then as I got down further in the pile, you began to get some that were readable and hadn't been so badly damaged. And Fred was meanwhile still looking for 1830. So I'm going through, and I open up Albert Neely's bill. And here, I've got a Xerox over here, and a color photograph of it out in the lobby, if you want to look at it, the front and the back. It goes like this. I'm looking at people of the state of New York versus the people versus the same, that is the people, versus Joseph Smith the glass looker, March the 20th, 1826. I said, how does that grab you, Fred? He says, you're kidding. I said, no, Joseph Smith the glass looker, March 20th, 1826. He says, you're kidding. So he comes running across the room. He says, you're not kidding. So then I went a little further, and I got the constable's bill arresting Joseph Smith, you know, and notifying 2 justices, subpoenaing 12 witnesses. Great guns. So anyway, when we got through, we found that bill, and then we found that Fred went back a couple months later and says, how's 1830 grab you? So we found the 1830 bills, and I looked around, and I thought, I can't leave these things in this wet basement here, and if Mrs. Smith is not going to be any more effective in removing it than last time, I'm just going to take it over to the courthouse. So we took them out. And when we got over to the courthouse was just closing. So I said to Fred, this is a fine pickle. I said, we don't want to put them back in the basement of the jail, and we can't get them in the courthouse.
because it's just closing. What do we do? So Fred said, let's take them back to where we're camped. We'll Xerox them off in the morning, and then we can bring them back. I said, that's a good idea. We were camped about 30 miles away in Susquehanna County at Montrose. Early in the morning, we got up, Xeroxed off our material, sent out copies to friends right away. And I said, okay, Fred, give me the documents, and I'll take them on back. He said, I'm not taking them back. I said, what? He said, if we take them back, they'll just get lost. I said, we can't walk off with these things. And he said, well, I don't want to walk off with them. I want to put them someplace where they'll be safe. I said, like where? And he said, well, some big library. I said, well, the only thing I can think of is Yale. They could treat the paper and everything for the water soakness and preserve the documents. So he says, well, he said, I found 51% of those are mine because I found bundles. And so he said, I'm not putting my 51% back. So what was I to do? So I said, okay, Fred, you take them to Yale then. So that's what he did. They went back to Philadelphia. He photostated them and took them to Yale, but very carefully signed them in my name. So I am the culprit who officially stole the documents. Well, I couldn't leave without trying to contact Mrs. Smith, and yet I had to get back to the East Coast to pick up some kids I left at Keswick Bible Conference. I tried all along the highway on the way back. Finally, late in the evening, I got a hold of Mrs. Smith to tell her we'd found the material and Fred was taking it to Yale. That didn't make Mrs. Smith very happy. And by the time I got back to Illinois, or shortly thereafter, I received a notice from the state's attorney ordering me to return the county's documents to them, or else. Well, I could see myself serving a long jail sentence. And so I panicked and got on the phone immediately and told Yale to send those things right back to me by registered mail because I wanted to make sure that I knew they had gotten them. And they sent them to me by registered mail, and it was then that I got the idea, when I opened the package to make sure they were all still all right, that I got the idea of photographing the 1826 bills in color. I did that, and I held them a couple of days to make sure I had the shots till I got them back from the photographers. And I got a letter, because word had gotten out by then. The Tanners had already published this one in their little newsletter. I got a letter immediately from a scholar, a Mormon scholar, named Bachman Danella, and he was up at Purdue in Lafayette and wanted to know how he could get to see this material. Well, of course, I had it right there, and I was going up on Friday to University of Illinois to Dad's Day for my son. And that was just about halfway between me and him. So I phoned him and I said, hey, you want me to bring these up before I drop them in the mail? Yes, he was dying to see them. So he came over and we met in the Holiday Inn in Champaign. And we spent quite a long time talking about the documents. He examined them. And after I got back home, he wanted me, of course, to make a set of color shots for him. So I had to wait a few more days to make sure they turned out. And I shipped them off to him, and when I did, I said, hey, could you write me just a little letter or something saying you've seen this material? Well, he did better than that. He made me a formal affidavit. And I thought, well, why don't I make an affidavit? So I made an affidavit, and I wrote Fred, and I said, why don't you make an affidavit? So I've got all three affidavits here, if you'd like to read them. And all those affidavits were sent to Westminster Seminary, and the originals are on file there at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. So that's where they are. Now, what do the documents really establish? Well, first of all, I think they clearly establish that Joseph Smith did do what was called in those days glass looking. He's called on the trial record itself Joseph Smith, the glass looker. But not only that, Joseph's father-in-law, Isaac Hale, had made an affidavit that Hurlbut had asked him to give. He hadn't written it in his own hand at all because his eyesight was growing dim. His son had written it. And the rumor spread that Isaac Hale was blind and couldn't even write. And so the Eber Howe, for whom Hurlbut was working, because Howe's wife had become a Mormon and he was interested in trying to fish his wife back to himself again. So Hale was asked in a letter by Eber Howe if he would make an affidavit. Well, the whole Hale family obliged. And the result was that an affidavit was drawn up and was not only sent off to Hale to be used in his publication, but they also published it in the local newspaper, which was called the Susquehanna Register. And the Susquehanna Register is still on file in Montrose, Pennsylvania. And here's the front page from May the 3rd, 1834, with the letter that was received from Eber D. Howe telling him about how the Mormons had said he was blind, and the former letter that Hurlbut had gotten was discredited by the statement that he was blind. And in it, Howe says, I don't want to publish something that's not true. If this is a phony, it won't do the cause of truth any good, either side of us, if we publish that which is not true. So if it is true, would you please make your own affidavit and statement and send it to me? So this was requested by Howe, but the whole production was not in the hands of anybody else except the Hale family. And of course, Isaac Hale was the father of Emma, who was the wife of Joseph. And he gives his little statement in here and talks about Joseph Smith and his money-digging activities in the area down in Pennsylvania and in central New York as well. And he talks about Joseph Smith doing what Joseph called glass-looking, notice the same term, in which a stone was put in a hat and his face was buried in the hat. And he said this is in his testimony, and you can read it afterwards. I'll have all these here with me. He said this was what really provoked him, that his daughter had married and went off and married a man like this, and he would have nothing to do with such a profession. Later in the testimony, he said Joseph promised to give up what he called glass-looking, and then he goes on subsequently to tell what happened after that. The same term appears again in a very early newspaper account that was published in 1831. Dale Morgan, who was an outstanding Mormon historian, a member of the LDS Church, was responsible for running down this magazine and uncovering this account. The article that appeared in this April the 9th, 1831 Evangelical Magazine and Gospel Advocate appeared on the back page of that magazine, and it was called The Mormonites. And this was written in 1831, just 1 year after the Book of Mormon came out, and just 5 years after the 1826 trial. And he mentions that Joseph Smith was about this part of the country in the character of a glass-looker, pretending by means of a certain stone or glass, which he put in a hat, to be able to discover lost goods, hidden treasures, mines of gold and silver, and so forth. And then he tells about how he was arrested and tried as a disorderly person and found guilty before a court of justice. But because he was a young man, he would have been just 20 then and not 21, and hoping that he would change his conduct, he was designedly allowed to escape. So they didn't really sentence him, even though they found him guilty. So again, the idea of Joseph Smith as a glass-looker, that term fits in exactly with the 1826 trial statement of Joseph Smith, the glass-looker. So I think now it's established beyond any question that Joseph Smith did do money digging, glass-looking, if you will, deep stoning, as some of the anti-Mormons like to taunt him with it, by putting a stone or a glass of some sort in a hat, burying his face in the hat, and professing to find lost or buried treasures. I think the second thing that these bills do is to establish the validity of the trial record, which of course itself is still missing. First of all, you recall when I read off the list of court costs on the trial record as it was printed in Fraser's Magazine and Utah Christian Advocate was $2.68. Mr. Neely's bill bears this information in connection with the Joseph Smith case. To my fees, in examination of the above cause, $2.68. It's true it's not itemized, but the total is exactly the same. The trial record itself at the beginning, if we had read it, indicated that the trial took place on March the 20th of 1826. This case is listed as having been tried on March the 20th, 1826. So as far as I am concerned, that alone was enough to validate the bill itself. But along with those bills, in addition, I found other bills. For example, there was another bill of Albert Neely's when he was also serving not only as the Justice of the Peace, but as a school commissioner. Along with that was a bill that was put in by the Commissioner of Common Schools and Highways, Arid Stowell. Arid Stowell was one of the men who took part in the 1826 trial and gave his testimony in the trial. So it establishes that he was indeed at Bainbridge at that time. In addition to that, the trial record mentions that Josiah Stowell, who was the one who had hired Joseph to come to central New York and northern Pennsylvania to work for him as a money digger, which even Joseph Smith's history admits that he had gone down to work with Josiah Stowell, that Josiah Stowell had heard about Joseph Smith from a relative living up in Palmyra area near Joseph Smith named Simpson Stowell. Nobody was able to find Simpson Stowell. Larry Porter looked and got a line on him and found that there had been a Simpson Stowell, at least a man of that name, who died in central New York and was buried in the family burial area of Josiah Stowell. So it seems quite likely that Josiah Stowell Simpson was Josiah's relative of some sort, and probably was his oldest son. But when I was looking around a short time later up in the Palmyra area in the courthouse in Canandaigua, I came across a land sale where Simpson Stowell of the town of Manchester, it's the same town Joseph lives in, is selling his property to another man, and the year was January in the year of our Lord, 1827. Just 1 year after the trial, Simpson Stowell is moving out of Manchester over into the village of Phelps. So indeed, all the persons mentioned in connection with the trial have indeed been identified as real persons living in that area. One other person is mentioned in the trial record itself, the missing trial record, and that is a man by the name of Peter G. Bridgman, who swore out the warrant for Joseph's arrest. For a long time, I couldn't figure out why a guy named Peter G. Bridgman would be swearing out a warrant for the arrest of Joseph Smith when the matter concerned Josiah Stowell. It was Josiah Stowell whom he was working for, and if Joseph was phony and a con man and simply milking Josiah of his money, why didn't Josiah's sons, or why didn't Josiah's wife, or someone else in Josiah's family bring some kind of charges against Joseph Smith? Why Peter G. Bridgman? From Larry Porter, I received, a fine Mormon scholar, I received the information that Josiah Stowell's wife was named Bridgman. When I obtained the Bridgman genealogy, I found out that Peter G. Bridgman was none other than Mrs. Stowell's nephew. That indeed, at that very time, he was only a few miles down the road helping to found a local Methodist church. He was just a couple of months older than Joseph Smith, a kind of a young whippersnapper on his own. And back in those days, women had disability before the law. That is, they couldn't do anything. Even a piece of property, the husband couldn't transfer to his wife. He had to transfer it to her brother or to an uncle or something, and then he would transfer it back to the man's wife. So she had disability before the law. Finally, it became clear that the children would be in an awkward situation if they had brought suit against Joseph living in their father's house when the father was thoroughly wrapped up in Joseph Smith. You can tell this by reading Josiah Stowell's testimony at the trial. Let me read you just a sample here to show you how thoroughly convinced Stowell was that Joseph was going to bring him a small fortune in money digging. Josiah Stowell was sworn. Says that the prisoner had been in his house something like 5 months, had been employed by him to work on a farm part-time, that he pretended to have the skill of telling where hidden treasure in the earth were by means of looking through a certain stone, that the prisoner had looked for him sometimes, once to tell him about money buried in Ben Mountain in Pennsylvania, once for gold in Monument Hill, and once for a salt spring, and that he positively knew that the prisoner could tell and did possess the art of seeing those valuable treasures through the medium of said stone, that he found and then the word is illegible to this writer, at Ben Mountain and Monument Hill, as prisoner requested, that the prisoner had looked through said stone for Deacon Addleton for a mine, did not exactly find it, but got, and then the word is unclear, got a piece of ore apparently, which resembled gold. He thinks that the prisoner had told by means of this stone where a Mr. Bacon had buried money, that he and the prisoner had been in search of it, that the prisoner had said it was in a certain root of a stump 5 feet from the surface of the earth, and with it would be found a tail feather. That said stolen prisoner thereupon commenced digging, found the tail feather, but money was gone. That he supposed the money moved down, that the prisoner did not offer his service, that he never deceived him, that the prisoner looked through the stone and described Josiah Stowell's house and outhouses while at Palmyra at Simpson Stowell's correctly, that he had told about a painted tree with a man's head painted upon it by means of said stone, and that he had been in company with the prisoner digging for gold and had the most implicit faith in the prisoner's skill. Now, with a real conviction like that, it would have been difficult for Simpson or anyone, for Josiah or anyone in his family, for that matter, immediate family, to have brought the matter up. But this young Methodist, almost might call him a hothead, a meddlesome person who was not afraid to rush in where angels fear to tread, swore out the warrant. And it's interesting that Calvary himself, in his account of Smith's life, mentions about Smith being arrested back in Bainbridge by some officious person. And of course the word officious means meddlesome. And I'm sure that's exactly the way Josiah must have felt, even about his own nephew, and it certainly would have been the way Joseph Smith felt if somebody was taking away his choice source of livelihood. Finally, Dr. Purple was at the trial, and some 50 years later, he wrote up his account of the trial, which appeared in a magazine called the Shenango Union, which I have copied off here, the title page and the article itself. Now, the Shenango Union account of Dr. Purple has some inaccuracies in it because he's writing by memory 50 years after the event, and he places the trial late in February instead of in March. But that's pretty good to remember that close after 50 years. He remembered in his recollection the prisoner was not found guilty and was let go. Well, apparently he was let go, but he was indeed found guilty. So there are some inaccuracies in the account, but it's interesting that among the bills that I found, along with Neely's and with Eric Stowell's, was another bill of another justice of the peace by the name of Zachariah Tarble. And Zachariah Tarble has an entry on there in which a warrant is sworn out by William D. Purple. Somebody had taken the poor man's overcoat in May of 1826, and he thought he knew who did it, and he swore out a warrant to try to get his overcoat back. But it incidentally shows that Dr. Purple was indeed, just as he said, in Bainbridge, New York, in 1826. So every feature of the trial record itself is verifiable, even though we still do not have anything but the printed accounts of the records. A further conclusion that these bills from Bainbridge, which I happened upon in the basement of the county jail, show is that we must now take the affidavits that up until now were all written, of course, after Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, and up until now have been summarily dismissed as completely worthless, as simply anti-Mormon documents that don't have a grain of truth in them, that we must now take them more seriously. Another thing rose out of this, and that is that when we are able to look at these accounts now as having some validity and some truth in them, we are able to come up more clearly with Joseph Smith's money-digging method. Joseph had indicated himself in the trial record that he had done money digging in Palmyra, but that he was going to give it up. This is what his testimony, his own testimony at the trial was. The prisoner was examined, says that he came from the town of Palmyra and had been at the house of Josiah Stowell in Bainbridge most of the time since. Had a small part of the time been employed in looking for mines, but the major part had been employed by said Stowell on his farm and going to school. That he had a certain stone which he had occasionally looked at to determine where hidden treasures in the bowels of the earth were. That he professed to tell in this manner where gold mines were a distance under his ground, and had looked for Mr. Stowell several times and informed him where he could find those treasures, and Mr. Stowell had been engaged in digging for them. That at Palmyra he pretended to tell by looking at the stone where coined money was buried in Pennsylvania, and while at Palmyra had frequently ascertained in that way where lost property was, of various kinds. That he has occasionally been in the habit of looking through the stone to find lost property for 3 years, but of late had pretty much given it up on account of its injuring his health, especially his eyes, made them sore. That he did not solicit business of this kind and had always rather declined having anything to do with this business. So charged with being an impostor, his defense was, I can really do this. I never asked anybody to do it for them. They came to me. I didn't solicit the business. I've done it successfully, but I'm planning to give it up, and I'll never do it again because it's going to hurt my eyes. So that was his defense. And it was about the only defense he could really make. But you notice he admits that he had been frequently doing it at Palmyra. So it isn't surprising, therefore, that we have any number of testimonies, both at Palmyra, and he also admits doing it in Pennsylvania, and also from Pennsylvania, about his money digging. When we look at some of these accounts, what we find is that he did his money digging this way. In addition to putting the stone in the hat and burying his face in the hat, there was always some necessity to break the enchantment in order to get to the treasure. There was usually a spirit guarding the treasure. And like all magicians since the Middle Ages, who have drawn a circle around themselves to keep the influence of evil spirits away from them, Smith would draw a circle with a sword on the ground all the way around the place where he planned to dig, sometimes driving in steel or iron stakes all the way around the circle, and then sometimes would sacrifice the blood of a sheep and cutting its throat and carrying the sheep around in a circle with sprinkled of blood, all to break the enchantment. It's interesting, in the unpublished manuscript of Lucy Smith's history, the first draft, Lucy kind of defends herself against the charge that the family had always been drawing magic circles and soothsaying. Whether she's denying it entirely or saying we didn't spend our full time doing that, we also spend our time doing some legitimate business work, is difficult to say from the way the sentence is constructed. But it does at least show that even Lucy was aware of the idea of drawing magic circles. This means that there was an introduction of the occult into the whole process. And the treasures, just as they would get near them, would either keep sinking lower and lower into the ground just as they were about to get to them, or else the enchantment became so great the treasure was snatched away and removed to the next hill, where they would have to go and repeat the process and dig some 20 to 25 feet again. To give you an example of the type of thing, the testimony of Mr. Thompson from the trial record reads this way. He said, after digging several feet, struck upon something sounding like a board or a plank. The prisoner would not look again, pretending that he was alarmed on account of the circumstances relating to the trunk being buried, which came all fresh to his mind. But the last time he looked, he discovered distinctly the two Indians who had buried the trunk, that a quarrel ensued between them, that one of said Indians was killed by the other and thrown into the hole beside the trunk to guard it, as he supposed. Thompson says that he believes in the prisoner's professed skill, that the board which he struck his shovel upon was probably the chest, but on account of an enchantment, the trunk kept slipping away from under them when digging, that notwithstanding they continued constantly removing the dirt, yet the trunk kept kept about the same distance from them. Says the prisoner said that it appeared to him that salt might be found at Bainbridge, and that he is certain that the prisoner can divine things by means of said stone, and so on. So that was part of Thompson's testimony in the trial. Now, others who have talked about it in other testimonies have said exactly the same thing about the material, the treasure, sinking down in the earth. It's interesting that even by the time Joseph Smith came to write the Book of Mormon, he had not rid himself of these notions of treasure sinking into the earth. And they provided a little grist for his mill in the forming of the story of the Book of Mormon. Notice, for example, the book of Gilliman, the 13th chapter, where it talks about the land being cursed, and your riches are cursed, and that they became slippery, that you cannot hold them. And in the days of your poverty you cannot retain them. And then it mentions being buried in the ground, and they become slippery, that we should lose them. For behold, our riches are gone for a month. Behold, we lay a tool here, and on the morrow it is gone. And behold, our swords are taken from us in the day of battle. We have sought for them. Yea, we have hid up our treasures, and they have slipped away from us because of the curse on the land. All things are becoming slippery, and we cannot hold them. Behold, we are surrounded by demons. Yea, we are encircled about by the angels of him who hath sought to destroy our souls. The same kind of enchantment, the same kind of slipperiness to the treasure that you find in Joseph Smith's treasure-digging situation. In fact, in the unpublished manuscript, which they very graciously have given me permission to see, we can't say too much about it because I promised the historian's office not to try to scoop Richard Anderson, who's putting a book out on the entire preliminary manuscript that lies behind Lucy Smith's history of Joseph Smith and his progenitors. But let me say this, that the preliminary manuscript is at points quite different than what was printed in the book. But the account of the plates, as Joseph Smith went to get them the first time, is the same in the preliminary manuscript. And in that account, he gets the plates by taking the lid and prying it up, takes the plates up, sits them down beside them, and then is concerned that maybe there might be some more riches in there, as Lucy's account said, for a pecuniary purpose. And so he wanted to put the lid back on and put the grass back over it so nobody could find it. And when he did that, he went to reach for the plates, and the plates were gone. And he couldn't find out what happened to him. So he asked the Lord, what happened? And an angel comes and rebukes him and says, it's because you wanted to get money out of this thing. That's the reason. And so he says, pry the lid off. You pry the lid off, and behold, the plates are back in the box. Just like the Book of Mormon. You put your sword down, and it disappears. You know, where'd it go? Puts his tool down, his plow down, or whatever it is, and it's gone. It keeps slipping away from him. So Joseph Smith has got the same magic elements even in the obtaining of the stories. But more than that, the money digging activities, I think, led naturally into the idea of locating the gold plates. In several testimonies, we learn that the people of Palmyra in the earliest period heard that Joseph Smith originally stated that he found the gold plates by looking in the stone. Before there was any story about an angel or anything, he was looking for treasure, and that's one of the treasures that he found. Martin Harris's interview in 1859, Martin makes a special point to point out that he asked every member of the Smith family individually without Joseph present, and then when Joseph came home, he asked him specifically where he found these plates, and they all unanimously answered he found the plates by looking in the stone which he put in the hat. A very early worker in Palmyra who returned to the scene, a newspaper man from Lockport up near Buffalo, near Niagara Falls, had his early apprenticeship in Palmyra named Orson Turner. And he went back to Palmyra and collected some information. In 1851, he put out a history called The History of Phelps and Gorham Purchase. And in that he noted that the story was very prevalent around. The earliest story that anybody had heard was that Joseph Smith had found the plates by looking in the stone. Hosea Stout had made a notation in his diary here in Salt Lake City when Brigham Young showed them Joseph Smith's cedar stone. Stout recorded in his diary that Brigham Young showed them the stone by which the plates had been found. More than that, not only did Joseph Smith, I think, originally get the idea of finding gold plates through looking in the stone, once he had claimed to have the gold plates, even if he added an angel story later on about it, the earliest account gave the idea that he even translated them by putting the stone in the hat and looking in the hat. For example, there are a number of testimonies to that effect. David Whitmer, for example, who claims to have been there when the book was translated, describes very vividly how the entire book, he says, was translated by putting the stone in the hat and burying his face in the hat, exactly the same manner as the treasure hunting was done. The earliest reference to this type of thing is in the Rochester Advertiser and Telegraph from August the 31st, 1829, in which, and also in another Rochester magazine called The Gem, both of whom got their information from no less a person than Martin Harris. And they both point out that Joseph Smith was in the process of translating the book by putting the stone in the hat and putting his face in the hat. Isaac Hale, whose testimony we've already referred to, said he was very discombobulated and disgruntled because of the fact that Joseph had promised to give up his glass looking, and then he walks in and here he is doing the same thing with the gold plates, and the gold plates were supposed to be buried out in the woods, and he was looking in the stone in his hat doing the translating. So I think that the money digging method was the earliest explanation of how the plates were found and how they were translated. Finally, Joseph Smith never did lose his attraction for treasure hunting. In 1836, and this is written up, we won't have time to go into it, in 1836, the rumor was that there was some gold in the basement of a house in Salem, Massachusetts. And Joseph Smith made a quick trip with some of the brethren who thought they knew where the treasure was, and he even received the revelation that all the gold and treasure in Salem was going to be his. But when they got there, of course, the poor fellow that thought he knew which house it was couldn't remember because Boston looked so different. And so they checked into the town and checked out very quietly, and Joseph never did get the material that he was looking for. Nor did he lose his interest in magic or in the occult. At the end of his life, according to Emma, and is preserved in the Vitamin family, Joseph Smith died with a little magic talisman in his pocket. Reed Durham did a sharp piece of detective work and unearthed the fact that it wasn't a Masonic piece, as Wilford Wood had thought it was, who obtained it from the Vitamins, but it was in reality a talisman of the planet Jupiter, and a person who carried this in his pocket was supposed to help create friendship and wealth and happiness and have power. And on it says, Confirmo Deus Potentissimo, which probably should be translated something like, make me powerful, O God. It is a shame that it didn't quite work for him, for he was supposed to have had it in his pocket when he was killed. You'll find that, a picture of it, in the lobby on the book table, where the Tanners have material that deal with many of the aspects that we talked about here. But in conclusion, then, let me restate what I started with, and that is that I think that in the light of the present research, that there seems now certain that Joseph Smith and other members of the Smith family were indeed engaged in magical practices that centered around money digging with the aid of a peach stone. And secondly, it appears that the idea of discovering gold plates developed out of the money digging activities rather than from any real divine encounter. And thirdly, the method of translating that the alleged gold plates were originally, for the alleged gold plates, was originally the same as the method used in money digging, with a stone in the hat and his face buried in the hat. And finally, it seems quite evident that Joseph Smith never entirely lost his passion for treasure hunting or his fascination for things of the occult. So that brings to a conclusion the material that I wanted to share with you. This was a little heavy, I'm sure, and if you want to see any of the documents, we'll have them out by the book table for you to look at. We thought it best not to ask questions. We're having to pay for this building by the hour, and we're supposed to be out of here by 9 o'clock if we don't want to get charged for a second hour. If you would like to share in the expenses, there is a box out there, and not to go to me, just to help defray the expenses. Anything comes out over and above that, why, we'll ship it on to a work that's trying to bring some sight to blind people in India and in Ethiopia doing cataract operations and humanitarian work. So I'll get none of it. Thank you very much for your time this evening.